So if you've been keeping track, it seems like all of a sudden there's just been a really big Godzilla revival. Next year is gonna mark the 70th anniversary of the original, so maybe that's part of it. And we're getting a lot of content. We're getting the spin-off series on Apple TV titled Monarch: Legacy of Monsters, and we're also getting a sequel to Godzilla vs. Kong titled Godzilla x Kong: The New Empire. But all these Western Godzilla projects are not stopping Toho from moving ahead with their first original Godzilla feature in 7 years, titled Godzilla Minus One.
Gojira Minus One.
Though it is kind of unfortunate that we're not going to get a follow-up to Shin Godzilla, especially after that big cliffhanger that they left us with. Apparently, when the Hollywood Godzillas were going on, Toho originally planned on building a cinematic universe from Shin Godzilla. But now it looks like those plans changed because instead Toho is releasing Godzilla Minus One. So I got really excited the first time I saw the trailer to this film. And that's partly because while I do like the fun of just seeing traditional kaiju monsters fighting, I've been really wanting a Godzilla to go back to its original horror roots. And if you watch the original 1954 film now, you'll notice that it's a pretty serious film. And it's the only one in the series that I consider a true horror film. And I think it's just movie magic because the time period that it's filmed in, you could tell that it was really not too long after the war. In fact, you could still see wreckage in the film that was from the war. In a lot of ways, Godzilla in that film was the embodiment of that fear of destruction. Also, you have to keep in mind that in 1950s Japan, they were just finding out about the horrific response to nuclear weapons. Death, cancer, the mutations, the unknown must have been terrifying. And that movie would go on to become this massive franchise, still pumping out movies 70 years later. And for me personally, I pretty much grew up with these films. I remember watching them for as long as I was alive. I especially remember just going to the video store. Yes, those used to exist. And I remember just looking and picking out the coolest looking monsters on the cover of the VHS. And for some reason in the 90s in the States, all we really had was the Showa era movies. And it's funny because that's also what my parents grew up with. So I'm always going to be more loving and nostalgic for the Showa era. And I also do remember my friends liking those movies a lot too. So it seems like a lot of kids back then grew up with them. But I remember back then not really knowing the difference between the Godzillas. I just thought American Godzilla and Japanese Godzilla were the same thing. Godzilla was just Godzilla. I also remember just getting all the merchandise. They had some great figures of all the monsters. It was really great times, and I'm always going to be nostalgic for that. So I'm always excited whenever a new Godzilla film comes out. And I feel like these movies really need to be seen in the movie theater. I feel like when I watch them at home, they're always not as good. When you hear Godzilla in the movie theater, there's just something magic about that. You can't replicate it. And the sound in this new film is outstanding. But unfortunately in the States, at least where I am, it seemed like Godzilla Minus One had sort of a limited release. It wasn't being shown as much as other films. And that's unfortunate because I feel like this should be the big blockbuster of the year. I understand that it's Japanese and people probably don't want to read subtitles, but I mean, come on, it's Godzilla. That's how it should be. So the film was written and directed by the award-winning Japanese filmmaker Takashi Yamazaki. And I gotta say, Godzilla Minus One is just visually stunning. And what I love most about this film is just the setting. It takes place right after the war. So this in many ways mirrors the original film. But I also just find post-war Japan fascinating. It was just such a chaotic time. You could see some of that in films like Battles Without Honor and Humanity. There's also the anime Rainbow, and those are really good depictions of that time period if you're interested. But unlike many Hollywood and even Godzilla films, Minus One has a surprising amount of emotion. Something I've wanted in a Godzilla film for a long time. And I feel like when you're seeing mass destruction, that should be something that affects the audience emotionally. It shouldn't be a fun experience. And even though I knock the Hollywood films a lot, I still did enjoy them. But with those films, I don't really care if Godzilla kills everyone. I'm always rooting for him. However, with this film, for once, I actually cared about the people in it. I was almost just begging Godzilla not to crush them. And like I said, this is the only time in the entire franchise that I felt that way. I actually really like these characters a lot, and that's not common. Also, the character interactions in this film are actually interesting and about something. Again, it's amazing that I have to bring that up, but when you watch a lot of these films, you kind of have to. And I bring it up because with the Hollywood films, I remember hearing plenty of people just complain that there needed to be less talk and more fighting. And to be fair, that's definitely true. The Monsterverse really took a few films for the characters to actually become interesting. And they did improve over time in the later films. But still, not anywhere close to actually caring about them still. And I feel like Toho's timing with Minus One really couldn't be better. This showcases how you really make a Godzilla film. And Japan rightfully should be the one to show everyone. This is their creation, their baby. And this film really does have great action from beginning to end. I was not bored at all. So the story itself, it follows Koichi. He's a former kamikaze pilot from World War II. And he first encounters Godzilla in a more dinosaur-like form. And this is in 1945 on an island during the final days of World War II. A few years later, after surviving this event, he returns to Tokyo to find it in ruins from the US firebombings. Both of his parents were killed in the air raids, and his home is nothing but rubble. As a kamikaze pilot who's failed to fulfill his duty to his country by giving his life honorably in combat, he is now looked down on, and he's plagued by survivor's guilt. On top of this, his brutal memories of Godzilla haunt him every night. Nonetheless, he still does his best to move on and do his part in rebuilding post-war Japan. Koichi's saving grace soon comes in the form of Noriko. She's a total stranger, but she's also lost everything during the air raids. The two become friends, and they take upon themselves to raise this adopted child whom Noriko found abandoned as a baby in the aftermath of the war. And all of them are just brought together by this tragedy. And they become as inseparable as a real family, despite not being related. Koichi eventually finds a new government job, disarming mines from the war off of Japan's coasts. And Noriko also finds a job in the city. And for the first time in years, Japan has seemingly found peace after starting again from ground zero. But unfortunately, all this progress is now threatened when Godzilla resurfaces more powerful than ever. And what do you get when you destroy ground zero? Minus One. So Yamazaki's film in a lot of ways is a testament to the historical determination of the Japanese people, who rebuilt everything after losing World War II. The war was one of the greatest tragedies in human history, but now Japan is faced with something even worse. And I gotta say, Godzilla in this film is really just an unstoppable force of nature. And he's actually quite terrifying in this. And like I said before, I'm not really used to not rooting for Godzilla in a Godzilla film. There's no reason for his rampage. He's this mutated wild beast that mankind has created and now must answer for. And I feel like this is exactly what Godzilla should be. A terrifying monster. Just a force of nature that attacks without reason, one that doesn't discriminate. This is the true horror of nature. And what I like is the film doesn't hold back in just showing the horror of Godzilla's destruction. It's very terrifying, it's very real, and you could picture it. And I also like how they went for a more traditional looking Godzilla, but it also combines some pretty different design elements that were from the other movies. So I feel like fans are going to appreciate that. And he also does something in the beginning of the film which I've never seen him do before. It was quite interesting. For this film, I heard that Godzilla is 50 meters tall, and that's actually consistent with the height he was in the Showa era films. And again, like I said, those are the ones I grew up with, so that's what I prefer. But what I also like about this film too is the characters are just ordinary people, and they're the ones that have to fight back. The United States refuses to help, and that's because they want to avoid any rising tensions with the Soviet Union. And the Japanese government is just working overtime on damage control. So it all comes down to the working class. And I feel like these movies are boring when they just follow the government officials. Usually they're just talking and nothing happens. And there's usually that scene where people in suits are just panicking and you see them walking down the hallway really fast and their papers are just flying all over the place. Luckily, there's none of that here. It's just ordinary people, and they have to take it upon themselves to stop this monster. And they're made up entirely of volunteers who previously served in the Japanese Navy. And a lot of the action in this film is just jaw-dropping. You can't ignore it. There's a lot of great sequences. There's one where Godzilla's just chasing this small wooden boat, and it's in the middle of the ocean. There's also one of him just charging up and firing his signature atomic breath, but this time it's on the level of a spirit bomb from Dragon Ball Z. Yes, it's that awesome. This really all is just a great love letter to the original 1954 film. And they even bring back the original score, and I loved every minute of it. Whether or not this is the greatest Godzilla film, one thing I know about it is that it answered exactly why I love these films so much. And it's an experience at the movies I'm never gonna forget. I can confidently say that any fan of Godzilla will at least find something that they really like about this film. And whether or not Toho chooses to follow up to this one with a sequel, I don't think it really matters. Because just like with Shin Godzilla, Godzilla Minus One is unique and powerful enough to stand the test of time. However, considering we're left with yet another cliffhanger, I don't think we're gonna say no to another sequel. But only if director Takashi Yamazaki returns. So all in all, I'm gonna say that Godzilla Minus One isn't just a great kaiju film, but I think it's one of the best films of the year. Anyway, let me know in the comments what you guys thought of the film. Do you prefer the Hollywood Monsterverse films, or do you prefer Shin Godzilla? Anyway, thanks for watching.